Millionaire Humiliates Beggar, but repents when he finds out who he really is. Of course, I will narrate part 1 with dialogue, focusing on the characters' emotions and feelings. Here it is. The sun set over Manhattan skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. In the heart of Wall Street, Alexander Rothschild III emerged from his office, his impeccable Italian suit contrasting with the city's dirty asphalt. Alexander walked with a firm step, the sound of his Italian shoes echoing on the sidewalk. His face, marked by years of ruthless dealings, wore an expression of disdain as he observed the common people around him. Pathetic, he muttered to himself, adjusting his silk tie. As he turned a corner, Alexander almost tripped over a figure huddled on the ground. It was an old man, covered in layers of dirty, torn clothes, sitting on a piece of cardboard. The old man looked up, his wrinkled face marked by years of hardship. His eyes, however, shone with a surprising intensity. "Boy, could you help me with some change for a coffee?" asked the beggar, his voice hoarse, but strangely dignified. Alexander felt a wave of revulsion course through his body. He looked at the beggar as if he were a speck in his perfect world. "Get out of my sight, you bum," Alexander growled, his voice thick with contempt. "Why don't you get a job like everyone else?" The old man did not back down. Instead, he looked directly into Alexander's eyes, as if he could see through his facade of wealth and power. "All is not as it seems, sir," said the beggar calmly. "Sometimes life takes us down paths we never imagined." For a moment, Alexander felt something strange, a twinge of, what? Blame? Recognition? But he quickly suppressed this feeling. "Don't lecture me on morals, you worthless," Alexander shouted, attracting glances from passers-by. "You're nothing, understand? Nothing." With that, Alexander pushed the old man aside with his foot, causing him to fall to the cold floor. The sound of the beggar's body hitting the concrete echoed in the street, but no one dared to intervene. As Alexander walked away, feeling powerful and justified, he didn't notice the old man's gaze following him. A look that mixed sadness, compassion, and a deep knowledge that Alexander could not even imagine. At that moment, neither of them knew that this meeting would change their lives forever, triggering a series of events that would shake Alexander's world to its foundations. The echo of Alexander's footsteps still resonated on the street as he entered his private club, an exclusive retreat for New York's elite. The aroma of expensive cigars and aged whiskey filled the air, but not even the luxurious surroundings could calm the turmoil in his chest. "Hey, Alex. Why do you look like you have so few friends?" asked James, a fellow banker, raising his glass in greeting. Alexander forced a smile, but his eyes remained cold. "Just the usual trash on the streets. I can't understand why we allow this scum to litter our city." James laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. "Come on, Alex. Why don't you tell us what really happened?" Something in James' voice made Alexander hesitate. He looked around the club, noticing the curious looks of the other members. Suddenly he felt exposed, as if everyone could see through his carefully constructed facade. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "This beggar. He had the audacity to stare at me, to talk to me as if we were equals." Silence fell over the group. Alexander could feel the judgment in their gaze, mixed with morbid curiosity. "And what did you do, Alex?" asked a female voice. It was Sarah, a corporate lawyer known for her sharp tongue. Alexander straightened his shoulders, regaining his confidence. "I did what any of us would do. I put him in his place." The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, and he felt a wave of nausea as he remembered the sound of the old man's body hitting the concrete. The club erupted in laughter and applause, but there was something forced about them. Something that made Alexander's skin crawl. "Bravo, Alex!" exclaimed James, raising his glass again. "Someone needs to teach these bums where they belong." But as the others laughed and drank, Alexander noticed something in Sarah's eyes. Disapproval? Disgust? For a moment, he saw himself reflected in those eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. The rest of the night passed in a blur of drinks and empty talk. Alexander laughed and toasted his peers, but each laugh sounded false in his ears. Each sip of whiskey left a bitter taste in his mouth. When he finally left the club, dawn had already fallen over the city. The streets were almost empty, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At every turn, he expected to see the old beggar's wrinkled face, those piercing eyes silently judging him. As he walked toward his penthouse apartment, Alexander could not imagine that his life was about to take a dramatic turn. The encounter with the beggar had planted a seed of doubt in his heart, a seed that would soon grow and threaten to crumble everything he believed to be true about himself and his world. Alexander turned the key in his high-security lock, entering his luxurious apartment. Silence enveloped him, heavy and oppressive. He loosened his tie, feeling suffocated, not by the silk, but by the weight of his own actions. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah. "What happened today wasn't right, Alex. You know that." He threw the phone on the couch, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. He walked to the picture window, looking out over the city he had always seen as his personal kingdom. Now the twinkling lights seemed to accuse him. Movement on the street below caught his attention. For a moment he swore he saw the old beggar looking straight into his window. Alexander stepped back, his heart racing. "Impossible," he murmured, running a hand over his face. "I'm getting paranoid." The sound of the doorbell made him jump. Who could it be at this hour? Hesitantly, he opened the door. "Good evening, Mr. Rothschild," said a middle-aged man wearing a simple suit. "I'm Detective Johnson. May I come in?" Alexander's blood ran cold. What is the reason for this visit?" The detective entered, his eyes scanning the apartment. "We received a report of an incident involving a homeless person this afternoon. Security cameras captured something disturbing." Alexander felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. I don't know what you're talking about." "No." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Maybe this will jog your memory." He showed a video on his cell phone. The scene of Alexander pushing the beggar played out in grainy black and white. This isn't what it seems," Alexander stammered, panic rising in his chest. "And even..." The detective put away his cell phone. "You know, it's funny. That homeless man you assaulted? He has a name. Thomas Hawthorne." The name hit Alexander like a punch. "Hawthorne? It can't be." "Ah, so you know him?" The detective smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Thomas Hawthorne, former CEO of Hawthorne Industries. Missing for 5 years, presumed dead. Until today." The room started to spin. Alexander leaned against the wall, his legs weak. "But how? Why?" "That is what we intend to find out, Mr. Rothschild. And you have just become a centerpiece in this mystery." As the detective continued talking, Alexander could barely hear about rights and accusations. His mind was elsewhere, going back in time 5 years. To the day that Thomas Hawthorne, his mentor and father figure, mysteriously disappeared, leaving Alexander to take control of a corporate empire. An empire he transformed with an iron fist and a cold heart. An empire built on the remains of Hawthorne's legacy. And now, the past had come back to haunt him, in the form of a beggar on the street. A beggar he had humiliated and assaulted. What did Thomas know? Why was he living homeless? And more importantly, what would happen now that the truth began to come to light? As the detective read him his rights, Alexander felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The night was far from over, and he knew that the secrets that were about to be revealed would change everything forever. The next few hours passed in a blur for Alexander. Interrogations, lawyers, camera flashes, everything mixed together in a cacophony of accusations and unanswered questions. When he was finally released on bail, the sun was already rising above the horizon, dyeing the New York sky with shades of orange and pink that seemed to mock his misfortune. Alexander staggered out of the police station, his eyes burning with exhaustion and shame. His phone didn't stop ringing, reporters, shareholders, friends wanting explanations. He ignored everyone. "Mr. Rothschild." A familiar voice called out to him. It was Sarah, standing next to a taxi. "What are you doing here?" Alexander asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah looked at him, her eyes a mix of disappointment and concern. "Someone had to be here for you, Alex. Even after what you did." Her words hit him like a slap. "You don't understand, Sarah. None of this should have happened. Thomas, he..." "Get in the car," Sarah interrupted, opening the taxi door. "It's not safe to talk here." During the journey, the silence between them was palpable. Alexander looked out the window, seeing his city, his kingdom, turning into a prison. Every billboard, every building seemed to scream his name, condemning him. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Alex, what really happened 5 years ago? Alexander closed his eyes, memories flooding his mind. I don't know. Thomas just disappeared. One day he was there, leading the company, teaching me everything, and the next. And you never questioned it. Sarah's voice was sharp. Question. Alexander laughed bitterly. Sarah, I was too busy trying to keep the empire afloat. Stocks were falling, investors were panicking. I did what I had to do. Even if it meant burying the truth. Sarah pressed. Alexander turned to face her, his eyes shining with a mix of anger and fear. How true, Sarah? That I was young and ambitious? That I saw an opportunity and took it? Yes, I transformed the company. Yes, I was relentless. But I didn't know. His voice broke. For the first time in years, Alexander Rothschild III felt tears burning his eyes. The taxi stopped in front of Alexander's building. But before he could leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. Alex, there's something you need to see. She took an envelope out of her pocket. This arrived at the office last night, addressed to you. It's from Thomas. With shaking hands, Alexander opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. The truth always finds its way to the light, Alex. It's time to face what we've done. Meet me where it all began. Tia. Alexander's world spun. Long-suppressed memories began to emerge. Whispered conversations, hidden documents, decisions made in the shadows. Oh God, he murmured, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. What did I do? Sarah watched him, her eyes filled with an emotion Alexander couldn't decipher. The question now, Alex, is, what are you going to do about it? As the sun rose in the New York sky, Alexander Rothschild III faced the most difficult decision of his life. Confront your past and risk losing everything, or continue living the lie that had become your reality. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, nothing would be the same. Alexander froze, the paper shaking in his hands. His mind raced, trying to decipher Thomas's riddle, where it all began. He murmured, eyes wide with sudden realization. The old pier, he whispered, turning to Sarah. That's where he wants to meet me. Sarah frowned, confused. The pier? What? Pier. Alexander was already moving, adrenaline replacing tiredness. There's no time to explain. I need to go. Alex, wait. Sarah grabbed his arm. You can't just go out like that. The police, the press, it's too dangerous. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time in years, Sarah saw vulnerability in that look. Sarah, I need to do this. Please understand. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fine, but I'm going with you. The taxi took them through the waking city. Alexander stared out the window, memories flooding his mind. The abandoned pier where, more than a decade ago, an ambitious young intern met the legendary Thomas Hawthorne. When they arrived, the place was deserted, the smell of salt air and rust wafting through the air. Alexander got out of the car, his steps hesitant on the worn wooden floorboards. Thomas, he called, his voice echoing over the calm waters. A movement in the shadows. And then, he appeared. Thomas Hawthorne, no longer the ragged beggar on the street, but also not the powerful tycoon he once was. His eyes, however, still carried that piercing intensity. Hello, Alex, Thomas said softly. It's been a long time. Alexander felt his legs weaken. Thomas, I don't understand. Why did you disappear? Why live like a beggar? Thomas smiled sadly. Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what really matters. He got closer, and Alexander fought the urge to back away. But the real question, Alex, is, why did you do what you did? Alexander's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you know? Thomas's voice was gentle, but his eyes were razor-sharp. The hidden files, the embezzled funds, the ruined lives. All to build your empire on the ruins of mine. The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He staggered, leaning against a rusty post. How did you find out? Thomas laughed, a mirthless sound. I never really left, Alex. I watched from afar as you turned everything I worked for into something unrecognizable. Tears began to stream down Alexander's face. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought that I was doing what was necessary. Thomas completed. It's easy to lose yourself in power, isn't it? Forgetting humanity in the name of profit. Sarah, who was watching the scene in shock, finally found her voice. What happens now? Thomas looked at her, then back at Alexander. That's up to you, Alex. Are you prepared to face the consequences of your actions? To do what's right, no matter the cost. Alexander felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Years of lies, manipulations, and greed stared him in the face. But there, in front of the man who had once been his mentor, he saw a chance for redemption. In a shaky but determined voice, he replied, "Yes. I'm ready." Thomas nodded slowly. So we have a lot of work to do. As the sun rose above the horizon, casting a golden light over the weathered pier, Alexander Rothschild III took the first step on a journey that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone his empire had touched. The road would be long and painful, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. A chance to right the wrongs of the past and maybe find the redemption you didn't even know you needed. The silence that followed was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. Alexander, Thomas and Sarah exchanged alarmed looks. "They found me," Alexander murmured, panic rising in his voice. Thomas grabbed Alexander's arm. "There's no time. Come with me." Without hesitation, Thomas led them through a maze of rusting containers and piles of abandoned crates. Alexander's heart beat frantically, each step echoing in his ears like thunder. "This way," Thomas whispered, pointing to a small opening in an old warehouse. They slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them. The smell of mold and sea air was suffocating. "Thomas, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. Before he could respond, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Alexander held his breath, certain they had been discovered. But the light came from a flashlight in Thomas's hands. "Welcome to my hideout," he said, a sad smile playing on his lips. As their eyes adjusted, Alexander and Sarah's mouths dropped open. What appeared to be an abandoned warehouse was, in fact, a makeshift operations center. Maps, documents, and photos covered the walls. Computers hummed silently in a corner. "What's all this?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas turned to him, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and sadness. "This, Alex, is the truth you tried to bury. Every forged document, every offshore account, every life ruined by your greed, it's all here." Alexander felt his legs weaken. He leaned against a nearby table, his eyes scanning the evidence of his crimes. I didn't know it had gone this far," he muttered, the reality of his actions finally hitting him full force. Sarah, who was looking over some documents, let out a shocked sigh. "Alex, this is much worse than we imagined. There are names here, people who lost everything," Thomas added. "Families destroyed, lives ruined, all in the name of profit." Alexander felt the weight of every life he had affected. Tears began to stream down her face. "What have I done? My God, what have I become?" Thomas placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Muffled voices approached. "Police. We know they're in there." Panic took over Alexander. He looked at Thomas, then at Sarah, his eyes pleading for help. Thomas quickly moved to a hidden panel in the wall. "There's an exit this way. We can escape, but..." He hesitated, looking directly into Alexander's eyes. "If we go, all of this," he gestured to the evidence, "will remain hidden. The victims will never get justice." Alexander felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Run away and protect yourself, or face the consequences of your actions. The knocking on the door intensified. "Last chance. Come out with your hands up." With his heart racing and his mind in turmoil, Alexander knew that the next step he took would change the course of his life forever. Redemption was within reach, but the price would be high. He looked at Thomas, then at Sarah, and finally at the door that was shaking with the banging. The moment of truth had arrived. Time seemed to freeze as Alexander stared at the door, shaking. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, there was a determination that Sarah and Thomas had never seen before. "No," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm not running away. Not this time." He turned to Thomas, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're right. It's time to face the consequences." Thomas nodded, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. "Are you sure, Alex? There's no going back after this." "Yes," Alexander replied, straightening his shoulders. "These people deserve justice. I deserve to pay for what I did." Sarah touched Alexander's arm gently. "You're not alone in this, Alex. We'll be with you." The knocking on the door intensified. "Last warning. Let's break down the door." Alexander walked toward the entrance, each step echoing with the weight of his past decisions and the promise of an uncertain future. He placed his hand on the doorknob, hesitated for a moment, then turned it. The door opened, revealing a group of armed police officers, their flashlights momentarily blinding the warehouse's occupants. "Hands up!" shouted one of the officers. Alexander slowly raised his hands. "My name is Alexander Rothschild III," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "And I give myself up voluntarily." The officers appeared momentarily stunned by the statement. Detective Johnson, whom Alexander recognized from the night before, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Mr. Rothschild, what's going on here?" he asked, looking past Alexander to Thomas and Sarah. Alexander took a deep breath. "Detective, there's something you need to see. Something everyone needs to see." He turned, gesturing toward the interior of the warehouse. "In here is the evidence of all the crimes I've committed over the last few years. Fraud, extortion, market manipulation. It's all here." Detective Johnson entered cautiously, his eyes widening as he saw the extent of Thomas's operation. "My God," he murmured. Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm ready to confess everything, Detective. Every detail, every embezzled penny, every life I ruined. No matter how long it takes, I'll tell you everything." Thomas stepped forward. "And I'm here to corroborate it all. I'm Thomas Hawthorne, and I have my own story to tell." The detective looked from one to the other, clearly trying to process the situation. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." As the detective continued to read him his rights, Alexander felt a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of sadness and admiration. "It's going to be okay," he whispered to her, although he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. As he was handcuffed and led out of the warehouse, Alexander saw the sun rising over the horizon. It was a new day, and for the first time in years, he felt truly free. The road ahead would be difficult, full of trials, both in the courts and in the court of public opinion. But Alexander knew that each painful step would bring him closer to the redemption he longed for. As he entered the police cruiser, he took one last look at Thomas and Sarah. No matter what happened next, he was no longer alone. And with that certainty, he was ready to face whatever the future held. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of testimonies, hearings, and sensational headlines. Alexander watched as the world he built crumbled around him, each revelation bringing to light more layers of corruption and greed. Sitting in his cell, Alexander stared at the gray walls, the distant sounds of the prison echoing in his ears. The contrast with his former life of luxury was stark, but strangely, he felt more at peace than he ever had. A guard appeared at the door. "Rothschild, you have a visitor." Alexander stood up, curious. When he entered the living room, his heart skipped a beat when he saw Sarah on the other side of the glass. He picked up the phone with shaking hands. "Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled sadly. "I couldn't let you go through this alone, Alex." He felt a lump in his throat. "How are things out there?" Sarah sighed. "It's chaos. The company is in freefall. Shareholders are suing, employees are being fired. But something unexpected is happening." Alexander leaned forward, intrigued. "What?" "Some of the people who were harmed, they are speaking out publicly. Not to condemn you, but to thank you for your honesty. Your confession is allowing many to finally get justice." Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes. "I don't deserve their thanks." Sarah placed her hand on the glass. Alex, what you did was terrible. But what you're doing now, that's brave. You're giving people a chance to rebuild their lives. At that moment, the door to the drawing room opened again. To Alexander's shock, Thomas entered, accompanied by Detective Johnson. Thomas? What's going on? Thomas approached, a tired smile on his face. Alex, we have a proposal for you. Detective Johnson took the floor. Mr. Rothschild, your cooperation has been invaluable. Thanks to your confessions, we are uncovering a web of corruption that goes far beyond your company. Alexander looked from Thomas to the detective, confused. I don't understand. Thomas leaned forward. Alex, they're offering a deal. In exchange for your testimony against some of the biggest names on Wall Street, they're willing to reduce your sentence. Alexander's heart quickened. A chance for freedom sooner than expected. But then, a doubt struck him. What if I refuse? What if I think I deserve to serve every day of my sentence? The room fell silent. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. Thomas looked thoughtful. Finally, the detective spoke. Mr. Rothschild, I understand your desire to pay for your crimes. But think of the lives you can help save, the families who can get justice if you testify. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. When he opened them again, there was a renewed determination in his eyes. I will, he said firmly. Not because of the reduced sentence, but because it's the right thing to do. Thomas smiled, a gleam of pride in his eyes. That's the Alex I always knew existed. As the detective began to explain the details of the deal, Alexander felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. Alexander Rothschild III's transformation was far from over, but each step brought him closer to the redemption he sought. And with Sarah, Thomas, and surprisingly, the law on his side, he was ready to face whatever the future held. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There will always be new videos, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement. The following months were a roller coaster of emotions for Alexander. Endless days of testimony, sleepless nights remembering every sordid detail of his past. Every word that came out of his mouth was like a knife cutting the bonds that tied him to his old life. On a particularly exhausting afternoon, after hours of testimony, Alexander was taken back to his cell. He had barely sat down when he heard footsteps approaching. Rothschild, called the guard. There's someone here to see you. Alexander looked up, exhausted, expecting to see Sarah or Thomas. But the figure that entered the cell made his blood run cold. It was James, his old colleague from the exclusive club. Alex, James said, his voice as cold as ice. Or should I say, traitor? Alexander slowly stood up, feeling danger emanating from James. What are you doing here? James laughed, a mirthless sound. I came to see for myself. The great Alexander Rothschild, reduced to this. A mouse singing to the police. I'm doing the right thing, James, Alexander replied, keeping his voice steady despite his growing fear. James approached, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. The right thing? You're destroying everything, Alex. Lives, fortunes, reputations. Do you have any idea what you set in motion? Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. What are you talking about? Do you think you're the only one with secrets? James hissed. Your little show of conscience is unearthing things that should remain buried. Powerful people are angry, Alex. And they're not going to just stand by while you drag them into the abyss. Fear gave way to determination in Alexander's eyes. It's too late to turn back, James. The truth needs to come out. James stepped forward, his face inches from Alexander's. Careful, Alex. Accidents happen, even in prison. It would be a shame if something happened to you, or Sarah. Alexander's blood ran cold. Leave her out of this. James smiled, a cold, calculating smile. It's up to you, old friend. Think carefully about what you're going to say in your next statement. Some truths are better left unspoken, don't you think? With that, James turned and left, leaving Alexander shaking with anger and fear. As soon as the door closed, Alexander ran to the small telephone in his cell, his hand shaking as he dialed the number he knew by heart. Detective Johnson? It's Alexander. We need to talk. Now. As he waited for the detective to arrive, Alexander felt his heart pounding in his chest. James' threat hung over him like a dark cloud. He knew he had reached a crucial point. Continuing with his testimony meant putting not only his own life at risk, but also that of Sarah and possibly Thomas. But to retreat now would mean betraying everything he had fought for over the past few months. It would mean letting corruption and greed continue to destroy lives. Alexander closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was an iron determination in his gaze. He knew what he needed to do. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Detective Johnson. Alexander braced himself. The conversation he was about to have would change everything, once again. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. Alexander knew that his next words could seal not only his fate, but that of many others. The redemption he sought now seemed to come with a much higher price than he had ever imagined. Detective Johnson entered the cell, his face a mask of concern. "Rothschild, what happened?" Alexander took a deep breath, trying to calm his frayed nerves. "Detective, the situation is more serious than we imagined. I just received a visitor, and a threat." He recounted the conversation with James, watching the detective's expression darken with each word. When he finished, the silence in the cell was palpable. "This changes everything," Johnson murmured, running a hand over his tired face. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Detective, I can't stop now. Not when we're so close to exposing everything." Johnson looked at him, assessing. "Do you understand the risk, Rothschild? We cannot guarantee your safety, or Sarah's." Her name made Alexander's heart clench. "I know," he said softly. "But if I stop now, it will all be for nothing. All those ruined lives, they deserve justice." At that moment, the cell door opened again. Sarah entered, followed by Thomas. Their faces were tense, as if they already knew what was happening. "Alex," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "We heard about the threat." Alexander got up, going over to her. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to put you in danger." She took his hands, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Don't you dare apologize. What you're doing is important. It's bigger than all of us." Thomas stepped forward, his expression serious. "Alex, Sarah is right. But it's your decision. No one here will judge you if you want to back down." Alexander looked at each of them. Sarah, Thomas, Detective Johnson. People who, in different ways, had become his family on this turbulent journey. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting emotions wash over him. Fear, guilt, determination. When he opened his eyes again, there was an unwavering resolve in his gaze. "I'll continue," he said, his voice firm. "But not alone. We need a plan." Detective Johnson nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. "I already have something in mind. But it's going to take a lot from all of you." The next few hours were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Protektionsschemas, escape routes, secret codes. Every detail was meticulously crafted to ensure not only the safety of Alexander and his loved ones, but also the success of his mission. As the sun began to rise, turning the sky pink and orange, Alexander found himself alone in his cell again. But this time, the silence was not oppressive. It was full of promise and possibility. He approached the small window, watching the new day dawn. Within hours, he would be back in court, ready to make the most shocking revelations of all. Revelations that would shake Wall Street to its foundations. Alexander knew the path ahead would be dangerous, that every word he said could be a death sentence. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, truly free. "It's time," he muttered to himself as he heard the footsteps of guards approaching to take him to court. With one last look at the rising sky, Alexander Rothschild III prepared to face his fate. The man who entered that cell months ago, selfish, greedy, lost, had died. In his place was someone new. Someone ready to sacrifice everything for the truth. The stage was set. The audience, waiting. And Alexander? He was ready to give the performance of his life. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There will always be new videos, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement.